I am sitting here with a bowl of ice cream. I take a big bite, swallow it too fast, and suddenly a sharp pain hits my forehead. It is strange because the ice cream is in my mouth, but the pain is behind my eyes. I used to think the cold was just hitting a nerve, but that is not really what is going on. Now, you might think you know what is going on here. Most people tell me it is just simple nerve pain. They think the ice cream hits the roof of your mouth, the nerve gets cold, and it sends a signal to your brain saying, ouch. Or, if they want to sound a bit more modern, they repeat a version where one artery suddenly dilates and pushes on the lining of your brain. Both versions sound very neat and clean, but neither is the full picture. The thing I find remarkable is that your body is not just sitting there feeling the cold, it is reacting to it. Brain freeze is not just a signal that something is cold. It is a fast, complicated reflex, or your body tries to adjust its own system. It is an active overcorrection. And that makes the real story much more interesting than just a cold nerve. To see what is happening, you must think about a different kind of system. Imagine a building with a complicated plumbing network and a pressure regulator designed to keep the water flowing perfectly. One part of a pipe, way out on the edge, gets hit with a sudden shock of ice-cold water. Now, the regulator does not just sit there. It senses that cold shock and tries to compensate instantly to protect the whole setup. But here is the thing. It is almost too eager to help. It overreacts, and for a moment, it throws the whole pressure pattern out of balance. The important part is not just that the pipe feels cold. The important part is that the control system's overcorrection sends a surge rippling through a different part of the network than where the cold landed. This is how I think about brain freeze. It is not a story about frozen tissue. It is a story about a system that is trying so hard to regulate itself that it creates a temporary mess somewhere else. But the important part of this system is not just that it reacts. To me, the real secret is how that reaction travels through the network. Think back to that pressure regulator I mentioned. When the cold hits one pipe in the basement, the regulator does not just fix that one spot. It shifts the pressure through the entire building. Suddenly, a valve on the top floor starts to whistle. If I were standing next to that valve, I would think the problem was right there in front of me, but I would be looking in the wrong place. The whistle is just a side effect, a ghost, of what happened far away in the basement. This is exactly what happens when I eat something cold. It is not interesting just because ice touched tissue. It is interesting because the body's control response spills out into a different location than where the cold landed. I felt the alarm on my forehead, but the trigger was in my throat. So how does this start in my head? I want to look at the very beginning of the chain. The whole thing begins the moment that cold bite lands on the roof of my mouth, the palate, or the back of my throat. This region is not just a plain wall of tissue. It is a high traffic zone for sensory pathways, specifically those tied to the trigeminal system. These nerves are incredibly sensitive to temperature changes, acting like a hair trigger alarm system for the body. When a fast bite of ice cream hits these spots, the sensors do not just send a polite note about the temperature. They fire off a rapid, high-priority alarm signal. It is important to realize that at this stage, nothing is freezing, and there is no cold in my brain. There is only a sudden, frantic burst of electrical activity coming from a small patch of tissue in my mouth that just got a massive shock. But here is the thing. My body does not just sit there and take it. Once that cold signal fires, my brain does not treat it like a tiny, local problem in my mouth. Instead, it recruits what is called a cranial autonomic response. That is a fancy way of saying my body's automatic control system takes over. This matters because this system is all about regulation. It controls the size of my blood vessels and how much blood is moving through them at any given moment. It is trying to protect me and compensate for the sudden temperature shock. In other words, I am no longer just feeling a simple ouch. My body has started actively turning dials and adjusting the entire plumbing system to try and fix what it thinks is a major emergency. This is where the physics of the situation comes in. I like to look at this through the lens of resistance and flow. When my body detects that cold shock, it does not just panic, it changes the way it handles its fluid. Specifically, the resistance in some of the blood vessels inside my head drops. It is like a doorway suddenly swinging wide open. Because that resistance falls away, the blood can move through much more easily, and the flow velocity, the speed of the blood, shoots up almost instantly. We have measurements showing this exact jump in speed right when the pain hits. The system is trying to regulate the environment around that cold signal. But because it happens so quickly, it overshoots. It is a sudden physical surge where the body's attempt to fix a problem becomes a new event all on its own. It is the physics of a system trying to find its balance and missing the mark for a second. Now, I want to be careful about how far we take this. This is where many explanations become a bit too confident for my taste. You see, when scientists use tools to look at the brain during these moments, they are often measuring flow velocity. Basically, how fast the blood is rushing through a specific vessel. But that is not the same thing as seeing every tiny detail. These measurements do not directly show us the exact diameter of every artery, or the specific pressure pushing against the protective lining of the brain. So, while the vascular story is very strong, I try not to turn it into a cartoon where one hidden artery has been caught red-handed doing one simple thing. Reality is more nuanced than a single vessel slogan. We know the flow changes, and we know the system is reacting. But we must be honest about where the direct evidence ends and the interpretation begins. That raises a question. If the blood flow is the change, why does it feel like pain in my forehead instead of my mouth? This is the part that gets me. It turns out the answer lies in how my nerves are wired. I must look at the trigeminal nerve, which is the main highway for sensations in my face. This nerve has different branches that collect information from my forehead, my cheeks, and my jaw. But when that massive cold alarm fires from the roof of my mouth, the signals get a bit tangled. My brain receives the message, but has a hard time pinpointing exactly where the emergency is happening. My brain basically makes a guess. And because the forehead shares the same neural highway as the mouth, it maps the pain to my brow. The vascular shift I mentioned is the physical event. But this trigeminal referral is what gives brain freeze its strange geography. It is why the forehead becomes the stage for a stimulus that begins in the back of my throat. The strange thing is how quickly the whole event vanishes. Brain freeze does not linger because the entire process is transient. Think about it. The cold shock is brief, which means the reflex it triggers is also brief. As soon as the local temperature in my mouth starts to normalize, that vascular control system I mentioned settles right back down. It is a self-limiting event. Once the alarm stops firing and the plumbing pressure stabilizes, the referred pain in my forehead disappears almost as suddenly as it arrives. It is a fast-in, fast-out neurovascular event that does not leave a trace once the system finds its footing again. But even if it is short, It feels significant. That is what makes brain freeze so memorable to me. The sensation feels much bigger than the actual time it takes to happen. I am essentially experiencing a massive compression of information. A few seconds of shifting blood flow and tangled nerve signals are being turned into one loud, simple message. Danger in the forehead. My body is not giving me a detailed report on vascular resistance or trigeminal mapping. It is just slamming the alarm bell as hard as it can. It is as if my brain is taking a complicated physical event and flattening it down into a single, sharp, conscious experience. For those few seconds, that one message is the only thing that exists in my world. There is a reason we started looking at it this way. In 2012, a researcher named Jorge Serrador ran an experiment to see if the cold nerve story was the whole truth. He wanted to answer a simple question. Does the blood flow in your head change when you get brain freeze? He took a group of people and had them sip ice-cold water through a straw, making sure it hit the roof of their mouths, while he used a special kind of ultrasound to monitor the speed of the blood moving through their brains. This was a pivot point in the history of the topic. Before this, we mostly just talked about nerves. But Serrador shifted the focus toward measurable hemodynamics. He was looking for a physical vascular signature of that sharp pain in the forehead. Think about that. Someone finally moved past just guessing about nerves and started looking at the actual plumbing. But here is the twist in that story. If you look at the popular headlines today, they often say that Serrador proved brain freeze is caused by one specific artery suddenly dilating and pushing on the brain. They make it sound like the case is closed, and we have a single vessel slogan to explain everything. But the result of that experiment was much more interesting because it was less simple. The measurements showed a change. Yes, a rapid increase in flow velocity in the anterior cerebral artery. But that did not happen in a vacuum. It was tied to a transient fall in resistance across the whole system. What his work really did was open the door to a much fuller model. It was not just one artery gets big. It was a demonstration of a fast neurovascular reflex where the sensory alarm in the mouth and the vascular adjustment in the head are linked together. I find it fascinating because the more careful version of science is better than the oversimplified one. It shows us that brain freeze is not a single broken part. It is a high-speed interaction between our nerves and our blood flow. The popular retelling tries to give you a finished answer. But the real work pointed toward a much more elegant, interconnected system.